The first rays of sunlight crept through the windows of the small community center where the volunteers of Warming the Heart gathered every weekend. The room buzzed with quiet energy as the group prepared for the day ahead. Folded maps, handwritten notes, and shopping lists were scattered across the long wooden table in the center of the room. Barron leaned over the table, his pen scribbling quickly across a list of supplies. His brow furrowed in concentration, but there was a softness in his expression, a mix of determination and quiet pride. Around him, the group hummed with chatter. "Barron, we've got everything for Mrs. Grace," Sarah said, holding up a bag filled with fresh groceries. Her warm smile always seemed to brighten the room. "She mentioned wanting those lavender soaps last week, so I grabbed a few extra." "Perfect," Barron replied without looking up, his tone focused but kind. "She'll love that. Let's not forget her books, too. She's been waiting for that new poetry collection." Across the table, Leo groaned as he tried to fold a stack of blankets into a neat pile. "You'd think after 3 weeks of doing this, I'd be better at folding. This is like wrestling a cloud." The room erupted into laughter, and even Barron cracked a rare grin. He glanced up and looked around the room, taking in the group's mix of personalities. Some were lifelong friends, others new faces who had joined over the past few months. Together, they had created something special, a family with a shared purpose. "All right, everyone," Barron called, his voice cutting gently through the noise. The room quieted, and all eyes turned to him. "Today's schedule is packed, but let's remember why we're doing this. Every visit matters. Even if it feels small, it's not. To them, it's everything." The group nodded, a collective sense of purpose settling over them. The morning sun was warmer now, streaming in golden streaks as they loaded their cars with bags of supplies and gifts. The anticipation of the day ahead filled the air. For Barron, it wasn't just another day of volunteering, it was a chance to create moments of connection, to bring light to lives that had grown too quiet. As the cars pulled out of the lot, the sense of hope and determination lingered, carried on the crisp morning breeze. The day had just begun, and so had their mission to warm hearts. The group arrived at a small brick house with a weathered mailbox that read Grace, in faded letters. The garden, though overgrown, still clung to remnants of its former beauty, a stubborn rosebush blooming defiantly in the corner. "Mrs. Grace loves her tea," Sarah whispered as they walked up the path. She held a bag of groceries in one hand and a box of tea in the other. Barron knocked gently on the door. After a moment, it creaked open to reveal Mrs. Grace, a frail woman in her late 70s with silvery hair pinned back neatly. Her hazel eyes lit up as she recognized them. "Oh, my dears, you're here!" she exclaimed, ushering them inside. Her voice trembled with joy. The interior of the house was dim but cozy, filled with the faint scent of lavender and old books. The group moved with practiced ease. Leo began tidying up the living room, Sarah unpacked groceries in the kitchen, and Barron sat with Mrs. Grace, leafing through a stack of poetry books she had left on the coffee table. "I found this one last week," Mrs. Grace said, her hands shaking slightly as she passed him a slim volume. "There's a poem in here about roses that reminded me of my garden." Barron listened as she read aloud, her voice growing steadier with each line. The others paused briefly in their work to listen, the quiet beauty of the moment settling over them all. When the house was clean, a meal prepared, and the poetry book left open on the table, Mrs. Grace hugged each of them tightly. "You've made this house feel alive again," she said, tears glistening in her eyes. As they left, Barron glanced back at the house, warmed by the thought that for a few hours, Mrs. Grace had felt less alone. Later that evening, Barron sat in his small apartment, staring at a photo on his desk. It was of his grandmother, a vibrant woman in her younger years, seated in a garden full of sunflowers. The edges of the photograph were worn from years of handling. Barron's mind drifted back to his childhood. He could still hear his grandmother's voice, singing softly as she baked, the house filled with warmth. But those memories grew colder in her later years. After his grandfather passed, she had become a shadow of herself, quiet, lonely, and resigned. He had been too young then to understand the weight of her isolation, but as he grew older, the regret lingered. She had passed away in a small nursing home, surrounded by strangers. That regret fueled his mission. Warming the Heart wasn't just a project, it was his way of making amends, a promise that no one would be left to feel what his grandmother had. The photo glimmered faintly in the low light as Baron closed his eyes. Tomorrow would be another day, another chance to keep that promise. The following Saturday, the group arrived at a modest bungalow on the edge of town. Mr. Harris, a retired carpenter in his 80s, greeted them with a curt nod from his porch. His wiry frame and sharp eyes made him seem decades younger than his age. "I don't need any charity," he grumbled as they approached. "Good thing we're not offering charity," Leo replied with a grin. "We're just here to visit. Maybe talk about all the amazing furniture you've built." Mr. Harris huffed but stepped aside to let them in. His house was neat but sparse, the walls adorned with wooden carvings and tools hung like artwork. As Sarah and another volunteer cleaned the kitchen, Baron spotted a broken chair tucked into the corner of the living room. "Did you make this?" he asked, running a hand over the worn wood. "Years ago," Mr. Harris admitted. "It's nothing special." "It's beautiful," Baron said, his admiration genuine. "Would you mind showing me how to fix it?" That simple question melted some of the older man's resistance. He pulled out a toolbox, and the two of them worked side by side, Baron listening intently as Mr. Harris explained the craft. By the time the chair was repaired, Mr. Harris was smiling faintly, his earlier gruffness replaced by an ease that hadn't been there before. As the group prepared to leave, Mr. Harris stood on the porch, watching them go. "Come back next week," he called out, his voice softer now. "I've got a clock that needs fixing." Baron smiled to himself. Slowly but surely, the group was making a difference, one visit, one connection at a time. It was late afternoon, and the group had returned to the community center after another round of visits. The usually cheerful atmosphere was tinged with tension. Bags of supplies lay scattered on the floor, forgotten, as the volunteers gathered around the table. "I'm just saying," Leo said, his arms crossed. "I can't keep skipping work to make it to every visit. My boss is starting to notice. And I've got midterms," chimed in Emily, one of the newer members. "I love what we're doing, but it's getting hard to juggle everything." Baron listened quietly, his jaw tightening. The group had grown close, but cracks were beginning to show. He glanced at Sarah, who was leaning against the wall, arms folded, her usual smile replaced by a concerned frown. "Look," Baron finally said, his voice steady but firm. "I know it's hard. We all have our own lives, and this isn't easy. But think about why we started this. Every time we visit someone like Mrs. Grace or Mr. Harris, we're reminding them they matter. That's worth the effort, isn't it?" The room fell silent. Sarah stepped forward. "He's right. I know it's tough, but we've seen the difference we're making. Maybe we just need to be smarter about how we organize visits, split into smaller teams, rotate schedules. We'll figure it out." A murmur of agreement rippled through the group. The tension eased slightly as Baron gave a small nod of gratitude to Sarah. They spent the next hour reworking their plans, dividing the workload more evenly. By the time they left, the group felt lighter, their sense of purpose rekindled. The following week, the group visited Mrs. Lin, a petite woman in her late 70s with sharp, inquisitive eyes. Her apartment was impeccably clean but eerily quiet, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Mrs. Lin hesitated as she let them in. "I don't need much," she said softly, her hands clasped nervously. "We're not here to give you much," Sarah said gently. "Just company if you'll have us." As the others began tidying the already immaculate space, Sarah noticed an old piano in the corner, its keys yellowed with age. "Do you play?" she asked, running her fingers lightly over the surface. Mrs. Lynch shook her head. "Not anymore. It's been decades. Do you mind if I try?" Sarah asked. Mrs. Lynn hesitated, then nodded. The first notes were hesitant, then smoother as Sarah played a familiar melody. The room seemed to exhale, the music filling every corner. Mrs. Lynn sat down slowly, her eyes glistening. I used to play this for my daughter, she whispered. Her voice cracked, and she quickly wiped her eyes. Would you like to play with me? Sarah asked, sliding over on the bench. Mrs. Lynn hesitated but eventually sat down. Her fingers trembled as they found the keys, and the first notes were shaky, but soon the music flowed. The group paused their work, gathering around the piano to listen. By the time the song ended, Mrs. Lynn was smiling, a real, radiant smile that transformed her face. Thank you, she said softly, her voice steady now. I'd forgotten what that felt like. A few days later, Barron sat in the community center, staring at a newspaper spread across the table. The headline read, Warming the Heart, Genuine Aid or Feel-Good Band-Aid? The article criticized the group's efforts, suggesting that their visits were a temporary fix for a systemic problem. It questioned whether they were truly making a difference, or just easing their own guilt. Barron's chest tightened as he read. He had always known their work wasn't a solution to the larger issues of loneliness and neglect, but seeing it in print stung. When the group arrived that evening, the article was the first thing they noticed. This is ridiculous, Leo said, slapping the paper down on the table. We're actually helping people. How can they write this? It's not entirely wrong, Barron said quietly, surprising them all. We can't solve the bigger problems. But maybe that's okay. Maybe the small things we do are enough for now. The group fell silent, processing his words. Finally, Sarah spoke. You're right. We can't fix everything, but we're making life better for the people we meet. That matters. The tension lifted as determination replaced doubt. The criticism hadn't broken them, it had made them more resolute. Together, they decided to keep going, one small act of kindness at a time. It was an unusually cold morning when Barron's phone buzzed. The message was from Mr. Harris's neighbor. Mr. Harris was taken to the hospital last night. Thought you should know. Barron immediately called an emergency meeting at the community center. The group gathered around, concern etched on their faces. I visited him just last week, Leo said. He seemed fine. He was even working on that old clock of his. Barron nodded grimly. We don't know how long he'll be there or what he needs, but I think we should do something. Maybe a fundraiser to help cover his bills or at least show him we care. The group sprang into action, organizing a bake sale, a car wash, and even a small charity concert. The community's response was overwhelming. People who had once been skeptical of warming the heart now donated generously, moved by the group's genuine care. A week later, the group visited Mr. Harris in the hospital. His face lit up when he saw them, though he looked friendlier than they'd ever seen him. You didn't have to do all this, he said, his voice weak but grateful. Yes, we did, Barron replied, sitting by his bedside. You're part of our family now. For the first time, Mr. Harris's eyes glistened with unshed tears. I never thought I'd matter this much to anyone again, he whispered. 2 months later, Mr. Harris had recovered and returned home, just in time for a community gathering organized by Warming the Heart. The group had invited all the elderly people they had visited, along with their families and neighbors. The community center was transformed with strings of lights, tables laden with food, and the sound of soft piano music. Mrs. Lynn, encouraged by Sarah, was at the piano, her fingers dancing across the keys as if they had never stopped. Mrs. Gray stood before the crowd, a piece of paper trembling in her hands. I wrote this for all of you, she said. It's a poem about finding light in unexpected places. Her voice quavered at first, but as she read, the words seemed to draw everyone closer. Mr. Harris stood nearby, showing off his latest woodworking project, a small clock he had made as a gift for the group. The air buzzed with laughter and conversation, the room alive with warmth and connection. Barron stood at the edge of the room, watching the scene unfold. This was more than he had ever hoped for. The next day, Barron drove to a quiet cemetery on the outskirts of town. He walked to a small grave marked with his grandmother's name and knelt beside it. We did it, Grandma, he said softly, placing a single sunflower on her headstone. We're making a difference. Maybe it's not as much as the world needs, but it's something. And it's because of you. For a long moment, he sat in the silence, the winter sun warming his back. His grandmother's memory no longer felt like a source of regret. Instead, it was a guiding light. As he stood to leave, he glanced back at the grave one last time. "Thank you," he whispered. He returned to his car, ready to continue the work he had started, knowing now more than ever that even the smallest acts of kindness could ripple outwards, touching lives in ways he'd never imagined.